Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today we are having a special guest, a prominent strategist from the United States, Elbridge Colby. Hello, Elbridge. How are you?
Doing well, Jacek. Really a pleasure to be back with you. Thanks for the kind introduction.
And I have not exaggerated a bit. You are the author of one of the best books on strategy that I have ever read, Strategy of Denial. So beautifully and neatly written in terms of the logic that I, of course, recommend to everybody. I believe that most of our audience already have read your book. And this is why we will not be touching all those, the discussions whether Europe first or Pacific first. Elbridge is known for advocating sort of focus on China. We will, and we agreed that prior to the program, we will do the case of how the United States would behave, or how the United States should behave if it were to follow the Elbridge's advice or recommendations in the following scenario. We're having war in Ukraine. We're having this great power competition escalating as it has been recently. All those tensions on flows, energy, semiconductors, sort of protectionism atmosphere, the mood here and there. And the Chinese decide to impose the selective quarantine on Taiwan, by which I mean that the Chinese will be deciding case by case what ships can transit, what ships can get to Taiwan, what airplane can get, and what sort of a quarantine that they would be choosing depending on their convenience, who can sail. And I don't need to tell you that maybe they will be letting the Japanese go and the Germans go and everybody go, except for maybe only military vessels of the United States, and sometimes they will be also allowing you to go. What do you think the United States would be doing? Just my last introductory comment to this question, because it has been fascinating for me how the United States react, is I think that the Chinese will have all maneuver space, and it would be upon the United States, the onus on the United States, to really change the global status quo and gather allied countries next to it. It's going to be a hard nut to crack.
Well, thank you, Jacek. Great to be with you, and really enjoy your insights and your discussion. So looking forward to this. I don't think the blockade is as attractive a strategy for Beijing as I think you do. And the first kind of point of order would be that the selective quarantine. So what is their theory of victory in this case, right? I mean, in a sense, what they would be asking for, they would clearly be escalating by imposing a quarantine. And their theory of victory would be the capitulation, presumably, of Taiwan in some meaningful way, right? In order for that to have to happen, their theory is that they basically impose sufficient costs on the people on Taiwan that they give up their, effective independence. I mean, not as a formal political matter, but their autonomy, right? So that should, given the polling on Taiwan and the kind of evidence that we can see, the victory of the DPP and even the fact that the KMT has moved away from one country, two systems, that's hard for me to see how they can readily do that. And if we look at the history of attempts at cost imposition, the U.S. itself, through things like the Cuba blockade embargo or sanctions on Vietnam, on Korea, on Iran, on Russia itself now, is not a very successful track record. And a selective quarantine would, as the way you described it, would actually be a relatively anemic version. So it sounds like food, medicine, types of energy, et cetera, would still be getting in, right? So the Taiwanese people themselves would not be suffering that much. Alternatively,
maybe, yes, and
maybe
demonstrate that they are in control of the process, sort of salami tactic.
But at some point, they're going to have to be, and this is going to get to the point about the American response. Alternatively, they can impose a genuine, true attempt to strangle the country. Now, this would be by clearly more provocative and more overtly hostile act that would present a clearer picture in terms of the onus of escalation. The thing is, I don't think the sort of nuanced selective blockade actually succeeds in bringing Taiwan to its knees. I think the Taiwanese would say resist, and then if they're getting enough food and medicine, then China's presented with the decision do we allow food and medicine to get in there? Because if you're really going to bring these people to your knees, at a minimum, you're going to have to try. Now, I don't even think that would work. But if they try a hard blockade, then that proposes to the United States, okay, are we going to allow this to happen? And if the United States doesn't respond to even a blockade, let alone a direct attack, I mean, a blockade itself is actually a relatively
act of war, basically.
It's an act of war, but it's also the Chinese decision to pursue that would itself reveal some concern about escalating to the higher level, right? It would, in a sense, we could reasonably infer that they were still somewhat intimidated by the prospect of escalating. Otherwise they would have gone the clearer and easier, more direct route. If they do that blockade, though, then it challenges the United States. I think the United States, now, what would it do? What should it do? I think what should it do is it should challenge the blockade. It should flag it should flag vessels and aircraft to bring in food, medicine, weapons, whatever. Maybe we could start with food and medicine, et cetera, politically. And dare China to fire the first shot. The problem with the blockade in this way, though, is at this point, the Chinese have forfeited the element of surprise, which is critical to making their implicit escalation option, which is invasion, more difficult. And so this is why I don't think now I think a blockade could be done in concert with the invasion, but the invasion is ultimately the kill mechanism. I mean, if you look at the American Civil War, there was a blockade on the South, but ultimately victory was because of the direct defeat of the Southern armies, or Germany as well. So I think that is. So I don't know what they would do. Now, what would this administration do? My impression of this administration is, despite their rhetoric, they are very focused on Europe, and they have a more contradictory or there's an internal tension in their China policy. There are elements of their policy that is more hardline. The sanctions that they are building up, focusing the military more on China, or at least over the long term, not enough in my view. At the same time, they don't want to over-provoke, quote unquote, the Chinese, and you can see that with their attempt to get the speech, the talk with between President Biden and Xi Jinping, the meeting with Secretary Raimondo. So they're trying to have this kind of nuanced middle position, which is very quintessential of this type of administration. And so I think I'm not sure how. I'm skeptical whether they would react with the kind of clarity and strength, measured strength, but strength that the situation would require. Even so, though, I think the Chinese, actually, a kind of this quarantine blockade would almost play to their strengths, to this administration's strengths, because they would have time to talk about it, to nuance it, to talk to the Europeans, which is their comfort zone. Whereas a situation in which the Chinese simply overwhelmingly attacked would be more difficult for them, because they like to talk a problem to death.
And it will be very difficult for them to convince the Europeans.
Right.
As the words of President Macron visiting Beijing apparently, confirmed, it will be very difficult to convince the Europeans to stand behind them and go to war with China. Right. Later on.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, I actually think Macron did us a favor. I mean, I don't admire his policy, but my view is, I think is that Europe, certainly its military contributions would be negligible in the first place in a Pacific conflict. Secondly, economic sanctions are, unlikely to work against China. They're not really working against Russia. Obviously, they degrade the military industrial capability, or they make the government's life a little bit more difficult, but they don't fundamentally change the trajectory of policy on a core issue. And China's 10 times the economic size of Russia, so it's going to have a lot more leverage. And then I think what Macron made clear is the Europeans are unlikely to do that anyway, and I actually would not be surprised, because the German, French, and other economies are highly dependent on commerce with China. So why are the Europeans going to join a failing effort to try to coerce the Chinese off the island of Taiwan, and essentially an exercise in futility at the expense of their economies? I don't expect them to do that. That means the military balance is what matters.
Yeah. So what would you do then if you were having a chance to prepare for such scenario coming, and in line with your proposed strategy?
I would make sure that we have not a close cut, but a distinct military advantage with respect to a denial defense of Taiwan, because I believe that if we can defeat the invasion, and ideally a little bit more, but certainly at a minimum the invasion, and not in a kind of Baroque way that involves everything coming together at the right point and narrow advantage and nuance. No, something where the Chinese see very clearly that the invasion would be foolhardy step.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is what I would focus on, and I would invest my political capital in ensuring that happened, and focusing the Japanese and the Taiwanese in particular, also the Australians and the Philippines, on building up this capability. It's putting a lot of pressure on Taiwan in particular, since their self-defense would be critical. And then with the Europeans, I would say, I'm not like, yes, we should have some semiconductor sanctions and de-risking, whatever, but that wouldn't be the primary focus of my policy. The primary focus, I think, in the security element domain at least, would be build up your own self-defense, as Poland is, I think, commendably doing, to be able to handle more of the responsibility for European security on your own, and then demand less on these economic sanctions, because the economic sanctions are unlikely to work anyway. So I'm actually more sanguine with some degree of continued commerce with China. I mean, we may have our own reasons to decouple for our own purposes, but I don't think it's going to work very much strategically. And if the Europeans complain, oh, we need to sell to China, stop fighting the Chinese, we'll say, no, you can, all right, if you want to keep trading, you do so at your own risk, but we're going to win this fight.
Yeah, I mean that historically sanctions have never worked against a major power that is connected, to resource pool and so on. So even against much weaker powers like
Even
Germany.
exactly.
Yeah. So and here, given the resource of Russia, connected by land with China, and the size of China, it's going to be difficult. And so I understand that, and also too much talking about decoupling is upsetting the Europeans, whose social contract is highly dependent upon stability of the global system. So long term, it's not good for the United States. Also, I think it's a breach of the Crow Memorandum from the beginning of the 20th century, where this British diplomat was suggesting that this dominant sea power controlling the global trade should never even threaten the blockade of
I forgot that part of the Crow Memorandum.
maritime domain, because there
Right.
would be a balancing coalition against this
Of course.
far-fetched threat, because it's such a scary proposition for those.
That's a great point. It's always implicit. The part of the Crow Memorandum that I usually refer to is the one where he says that aggressive powers don't normally advertise their intentions.
Yeah.
But this is another point, which China's actually said that it wants to have the ability to conquer Taiwan by 2027. So it's actually violated the Crow Memorandum. It's gone beyond that. But that's an excellent point, where, I mean, the thing about economic sanctions is it's almost like, I don't know what the metaphor is, but it's like the thing that as soon as you talk about or touch it, it fades away. In the sense that there is leverage there, but we've used it so much, and I mean, forget Japan. I mean, think about the sanctions we put on North Korea, Iran, Cuba. I mean, Cuba has survived 30 years without the Soviet Union, despite being under an embargo.
Elbridge, I also analyzed recently the case of Mussolini's Italy and Ethiopia. The sanctions also fail. Of course, the sanctions were designed as today against Russia, according to this, treasury theory, no admiralty theory, no blockade of oil, no embargo, but assets, foreign market capital, so that you can't get money for your export and transform into military expenditure. And Italy didn't give a damn. Pardon my French. They conquered Ethiopia, and moreover, the fear of sanctions also drove Hitler and his, minions to really push forward to intimidate Eastern Europeans by unequal treaties on raw minerals and so on. So it even accelerated the march to global war.
I think the Italian example is, I mean, and I'm not the world's expert by far on this period, but I mean, up until 36 or so, the Italians were still assumed to be at least leaning towards the Allied side.
Yeah.
And there was, I mean, to me, you have to be careful about historical analogies and so forth. But I mean, I'm sure Mussolini himself figured he had made a mistake, and it wasn't foreordained. I mean, if you look, for instance, at Franco did not enter the war.
Yeah.
On
Hitler's side. All he could to avoid it.
Exactly. So it wasn't, and I mean, the ideological alignment among those figures was sort of uncertain and evolving. I mean, obviously, so this was something that could have been handled. I mean, obviously, it's not our fault, but the lessons are I think commonly today it's sort of everything is sort of reduced to Munich, and Munich was a disaster. But I mean, the real lesson here, to me, I'm always, I mean, it's a little cheap, but I just feel like Churchill is used to flog people like us who are thinking strategically. And it's like, well, no, Churchill's point was the importance of rearmament, the importance of focusing on the main. I mean, he left Singapore very vulnerable. I mean, but he turned out to be right. I mean, it was more important to hold the line in Europe at the time than it was to keep vainly try to keep Singapore.
Yeah, but Churchill is a good example that Churchill was changing his mind depending on circumstances.
Right.
Because by removing some armaments of Singapore, he followed the footsteps of Jackie Fisher from the First World War, right, who was attacked at the time by the same Churchill,
That's right, exactly. Churchill's all over the place, but he eventually got to the right place. Yeah,
for doing this, basically.
Right. No, Fisher was right. Fisher was, the thing I like, the Fisher analogy is, I mean, he deserves so much credit. It's a rare historical example of prioritization. But my critique, and just as a strategic perspective, I mean, America did not behave sort of without reproach in these periods. But my critique of British policy is that it got 90% of the way there, but that ultimately wasn't enough, in the sense that the British settled, they refocused the Navy on the Channel and the home islands, the North Atlantic. They settled issues not only with the United States, but with Japan, France, and Russia. They got all the way there. They were in staff talks with the French, but they didn't have a deployed army, in France or Belgium. Yeah. And that wasn't enough for the Germans. I mean, in the sense, it's like, people say, "Oh, we've changed so much," but we're not racing against ourselves. I mean, you have to applaud what the British did, but at the end of the day, it wasn't enough to deter the Germans, because they said, "Well, the attitude was, well, we'll pick up the British field army with our police force," right? What Bismarck's line. It wasn't enough.
Kaiser said, yeah. But still, it's always a question of failure of deterrence. And apparently, we had a failure of deterrence in case of Ukraine as well, because right, at the end of the day, Biden was threatening Russia with severe consequences, and still they attacked. Of course, notwithstanding the attrition and the resistance that was put up by the Ukrainians, Biden couldn't predict it. So coming back to Taiwan, I understand that you would like to equip the Taiwanese forces with anti-denial capabilities, but apparently those guys don't want to be equipped with only anti-denial capabilities. Again, all those, including Poland, that's the same story. We want to have a big navy. Can you imagine that? Right. So what arguments would you put to those literal, countries that are, shouldn't project power overseas, right, but instead they should focus on the axis? Just
I don't know, honestly,
how to do it. What's wrong with the strategic culture of countries like Taiwan, but also my dear Poland, that we're having the same issue?
Well, I mean, Poland deserves a lot of credit. I'm not just saying this because you're increasing defense spending. You've invested tremendously in your ground forces and tactical aviation and so forth. And my sense is that Poland is pretty rare in European countries these days, and having a strong and confident strategic culture, of which your podcast is a leading example, and your writings and so forth. So I applaud that. And that's, even though one of the things I like about talking to many Poles is they don't necessarily agree with me, but we're talking in the same language. You know what I mean? Like of and it's a kind of rational language of strategy. And it's tough. It's not about making other people feel good. It's about getting the best answer for your country and so forth. Taiwan it's a real problem, because I'm not sure how much these people want to survive as an autonomous entity. I'm really not, because there's a lot of sort of, it's almost like people infantilize them, because people are saying, "Oh, you can't." For instance, I basically concluded that they have, to put it a little bit rudely, but I think it gets to the point. They have their head stuck in the sand, like an ostrich, and they're hoping that the Chinese and the Americans will ignore them. And my point is that, I'm sorry, but that's not a luxury which you have. I mean, if you're a Baltic state or Taiwan or Israel, or pick your other example, you are too important to be ignored. You will never be ignored. So you have to live with that. You're not New Zealand. You're not Chile, a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. If you're Poland, you're too important. You're right on that plane. You are going to be important. So you had better be strong, and you better have a clear orientation with somebody who can help you, right? Which, I mean, you guys understand very well. But the Taiwanese seem to think, well, and the example to me, I've been trying to kind of, frankly, prod them, because I think the inertia is insufficient. They spend less than we do as a proportion of their GDP on defense. They're not clearly focused on a denial defense. They're buying these amphibious assault craft. Why that is, I have some theories, but at the end of the day, I hope they are interested enough in their own political survival and possibly their actual survival to invest in something that's more serious, to follow in the footsteps of Poland or Finland or
Yeah.
Israel or what have Vietnam. But the reaction, I mean, I've gotten a little bit of hot water there because I've said that we should blow up TSMC if the Chinese attack. And to me, that's like table stakes. That's like the entering thing. I mean, of course, we're not going to let China capture one of the crown jewels of the global economy intact and then be able to use it to coerce us. That would be insane. But the fact that the Taiwanese don't see that that's kind of like the baseline is very disturbing, but maybe it will help awaken them, a la the British of 1937. You say, well, 38, this guy can't be reasoned with. We better be strong.
There is also an argument because, Ukrainians have land bridge to Poland and they can be supplied. While in case that there is this quarantine is successful, at least there is a denied battle space at sea towards the Taiwan island. They may not be equipped. I mean, and supplied. It's a different story and different geography. Tyranny of the Pacific is
Exactly.
compare Europe and the Pacific. I find it really they position very difficult in terms of the military balance, even without shooting a shot. And at the end of the day, it's about equilibrium. That is deciding persuasively the politicians to even bend the wagon sometimes, right? So yeah.
No, I agree with you. I mean, yeah, I mean, so they have the advantage of water, which is it takes 100 miles across the Taiwan Strait for the Chinese to get at them. But they're also 5,000 miles from the continental United States or whatever, 7,000 miles. And so I think we have to assume that any resupply in the event of a conflict would be pretty minimal. I mean, just because it would be very difficult to get in there, very difficult, if at all. So they've got to be as ready as they possibly can be. And the other thing is, Ukraine is a huge country. It's the second largest country in Europe after Russia itself. Its population is what, a third or a quarter of Russia's?
I mean, depending how you count, because they were really diluted, so to speak, by war, immigration, crises,
but a substantial fraction. China's more like 75 times the size of Taiwan, population-wise, and huge, much, much larger land area. So, I think if they want, and I don't think that if you're thinking about it from the CCP's point of view, from Xi Jinping, he's not going to let Taiwan operate autonomously within the construct of the People's Republic, especially if it takes force to get at them. He's going to make sure that this, look, they're a communist, Marxist-Leninist party. They're not going to let these ideological viruses out into the system.
Since we're speaking in detail about this, how would you transform the American military to face the challenge, so to speak?
Yeah.
There's a lot of debate about the obsolescence of the aircraft carriers, power projection capabilities, denial, show of force. How would you reconcile everything? What kind of force would you put forward?
Well, I mean, I tend to stay out of the specifics partially because of my, I know more than a lot of people, but I'm not a true expert on the kind of military hardware. But also because I think I try to stick at what is the and my experience in the Pentagon is that if you communicate it like a real strategy, not like do everything, but actually saying this is what I want the military to be able to do in this context, this is the standard, people get it. Military professionals get it.
It's an important discussion. It's about capabilities that we need to field in order to achieve some outcome.
Exactly.
Instead of talking about particular armaments, weapon system, and so on.
Right. Exactly. And that's the better way. And also, my experience and what I've heard from people whose views I respect, the best is to describe the strategy and, if you will, the operational problems. Like if you look at the overhaul of the American military in the 70s after Vietnam, it was focused on the Warsaw Pact, the potential invasion of Western Europe, echelon forces, and we developed a military that was good enough, to deter that, thank God for everybody. That's sort of what I want, which is, so I don't say, oh, cut the Army to zero. I say, well, look, I think Navy, air, and space are going to be very relevant, but look, if the Army especially as China develops power projection forces, I could see the Army having an important role. I look at what U.S. Army Pacific is doing, very innovative. Look what the Marines are doing. That's great. That has advantages. How can we operate that? And then it also allows experimentation and innovation at the military level, instead of being like, oh, I have the answer to all these problems. No, like, here's the structure, and then it's almost like you're a big company and you've got a theory, and then you buy up the most promising startups instead of trying to figure everything out yourself.
I follow the same. Maybe I learned it from you, by the way.
Well, probably the other way around.
Really, this is the way we operate at Strategy&Future as well. It's not always understood and welcome in Poland, because there's too much talk about particular military equipment, that replace strategy in the first.
Yeah, no, same here, same in the U.S.
Yeah. Okay. So I fully understand, and it's so nice that you sort of openly stated that.
Yeah.
Well,
that's just true. I wasn't just. It's good. I'm not surprised we think along similar lines here, but yeah.
Yeah, so it's really important. Poland is also undergoing a major change. We invest. We will be the frontline state.
Right.
So our military culture, strategy culture, is also maturing. So this is one of the elements of how you mature in understanding, how you dialogue that, how you debate on such issues. Yeah, so we're growing up, so to speak.
Well, Poland has a very distinguished military history, so I wouldn't presume, but we all have to adapt, So
true, adaptation is a key. So my last question, Elbridge, you may you may not you may decide not to answer that question. Do you think that the structural forces are making us think hard that we are really destined for the military confrontation between U.S. and China, or what do you think? What do you think? People really start talking about?
Yeah, I think it's a very real possibility. I wouldn't have the audacity to put a number by it in terms of probability. It's too stochastic or whatever, interdependent. But I think the structural factors are pushing, and that's largely they relate to an established power and a rising power, and the incentives of the rising power to break apart the anti-hegemonic coalition and establish new rules. I don't like the term, and I actually don't think the administration's phrasing is right, but the sort of rules-based international order, the Chinese are not. That's not the world that they want to be the preeminent power, and it's understandable why they want to be. It's not necessarily good or acceptable or something that we should roll over about, but it's structurally understandable because it's great to be the king, right? And that's what they're pursuing. And the way I'm convinced that the stakes of what is at issue are geoeconomic, but the means are primarily going to be military. If we get the military right, I think we can work out the balance of power. I think because the incentives will be towards some equilibrium. And this is, the part that, like, Kissinger understates, and a lot of people, that getting that military balance right, even at the cost of bearing risk to do so, because we've neglected it too long, is critical to getting that equilibrium, in my view.
Perfect answer. Very interesting and sort of insightful. Thank you very much, Elbridge.
Thank you, Jacek. Always a pleasure.
Looking forward to the next time. I'll try to get you again to my program.
I promise to be less difficult, or I will pledge to be less difficult.
Our guest today was Elbridge Colby. Thank you, Elbridge, again.
Thank you, Jacek.
Stay with us at Strategy&Future. Thank you.